In the public's perception, Western migration is replete with tales of rugged individualism, perseverance, ingenuity, and heroism, and their opposites. The popular understanding of the movement evokes iconic, albeit mistaken, images of straining teams of oxen and horses, rather than mules, yoked to creaking wagons driven by hardy pioneers of European stock who steadfastly piloted their prairie schooners through relentless plains, searing deserts, and heart-stopping mountain passes. The traditional Western narrative, no matter how compelling, falls short of the real story of overland migration and the diversity and conflict that define this undertaking. African American men, women, and children were Western pioneers too. Enslaved or free, they were an integral part of the human tide that undertook the long journey across the continent. That's a passage from the book Sweet Freedom's Plains. I'm Jen Globius, and this is the Halenaki Deep Dive, a podcast about the process of mapping and analysis for historical and archaeological research using open source tools. In this episode, I'll step back a bit from Ruth Shackleford's diary to discuss Black pioneers and travelers on the Western trails, based on the book Sweet Freedom's Plains by Shirley Ann Wilson Moore, and give you an update on exporting data from nodegoat, which I had trouble with in the last episode. Let's dive in. So I ran across the book Sweet Freedom's Plains. I found the PDF version of it that was linked off the National Park Service when I was doing research on the trails that I talked about in the last episode. And I read it for this episode, partly because it's Black History Month, it's February, and also because I really had no background or any knowledge about the role that Black people played in the Western trails. And this book was a great introduction to that. I'll put links to both the PDF, which isn't complete. It's through the National Park Service version of the book. It doesn't have all of the maps included and some of the images. But the book was also published a few years ago, and I'll put a link to where you can get a copy of the book that way as well in the show notes. So Sweet Freedom's Plains, the author intended to illuminate the history of Black people on the Western trails between 1841 and 1869. So 1869 being when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And the way that she gave light to the history of Black people on the trails was by examining their perceptions of the journey and the perceptions of the West, as well as their actual experiences on the trails using traveler accounts, census records, and oral histories, so bringing together information from many different sources. The focus of the book is on both the perceptions of the trails and the West, and on the realities of both of those for Black people. So the West and the trails didn't always live up to what they were hoping for. There are accounts of different stories of Black people's experiences that illustrate different points in the book. Just a few highlights of some of the early Black pioneers. So one of the earliest Black people that explored the western part of North America was Esteban, who was the slave of Dorantes, one of the Spanish conquistadors, on a 1527-1528 expedition in the Gulf of Mexico. And I believe that James Michener, in his historical novel, Texas, includes a fictional account of Esteban's story. I believe he appears as a character. So one of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition was the slave of William Clark named York. And he had been promised freedom after the expedition had ended, which he took part of in it fully, was a valuable member of the team. But when they get back to after their trip, Clark delayed the freedom for York for 10 years. So there was freedom eventually, but not as promised. And this is a theme that comes up again and again in the stories in Sweet Freedom's Plains. A mountain man who turned the guiding wagons was James Beckworth, who is thought to be Black, although sources don't all concur. He was a mountain man, an explorer who had been trading furs before the first immigrant wagons started going over the plains. And because he had so much knowledge of the West, he was sought out as a wagon guide as the wagons of white settlers and Black settlers heading west. So the last early historical Black pioneer I want to talk about is a man named J.H. Jefferson, who is thought to be a son of Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings. And T.H. Jefferson was granted his freedom, and he went out to explore the West in the 1840s. And he looked at it with he was good at map making and taking notes. He was of a somewhat scientific bent. And he created a map and a guidebook of the Overland Trail that was published in 1849 and served as the guide for some people traveling 1849 and onwards. He gave very precise information about the distance to different watering holes and where supplies could be acquired. So part of why I really enjoyed reading Sweet Freedom's Plains was learning the stories of these Black pioneers among the many other stories. And these were fairly good stories. They were stories of Black people who were taken advantage of over and over again and lacking resources and the ability to actually overcome prejudice. Although there were also many stories of Black people who were able to make good and contribute and help other people and to establish community in the West. So Sweet Freedom's Plains is well worth the read. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the main points from Sweet Freedom's Plains and talk a little bit about how that compares with Ruth Shackelford's diaries. Keeping in mind that Ruth Shackelford was a white woman who lived in Missouri, which was a slave state at the time. They set off from Missouri and eventually returned there in 1868, and they were middle-class white people. One of the major points that is made in Sweet Freedom's Plains is that there aren't as many mentions of Black people in accounts of the trails, mostly because they're marginalized. So most of the written accounts that we have are written by white people, and so they often show bias against Black people in their activities, or they don't even mention those activities at all. So the author of Sweet Freedom's Plains takes information from white people as a useful thing, but you have to use caution. You can't just take them at their word, at face value, because they're usually dismissing or diminishing Black people. Based on that, I decided to look through the introductions to all of the Covered Wagon Women series that Ruth Shackelford's diaries are published in, because they're easily available online. I only own volume 9, which Ruth Shackelford's diaries are in, but you can read all the introductions online. And the focus of the series of Covered Wagon Women is on women pioneers and bringing them to the spotlight, which they hadn't been in the early 80s when the series began to be published. And so there's no focus on race. There's very little discussion by the editor, Kenneth Holmes, about race at all. And mostly, if any discussion, was mostly in terms of white people and their interactions with indigenous peoples. But there were some extra introductions when the books were reprinted by Bison Books. So one part, I read those introductions. I was trying to figure out if any of the diaries published in Covered Wagon Women included Black women. And I suspected not, but I wanted to double check. So don't completely know for sure, but I highly suspect Black women's accounts were not included in the book series. And Maria E. Montoya, in her introduction to the Bison Books edition for Volume 8, has this line, quote, "So why publish or read another collection of trail diaries from white, relatively middle-class women?" End quote. And she goes on to say that their experiences are still interesting and informative, which of course they are, and they illuminate something. But I took this to mean that the women in the Covered Wagon Women series were all white women. And there's also Catherine G. Morrissey, in her introduction to the Bison Books edition for Volume 11, the last book in the series, says, quote, "The Oregon Trail story, as retold through these diaries, is largely an Anglo one, in which Chinese, Indians, Mexicans, Mennonites, Mormons, and Gypsies play roles as colorful bit characters," end quote. So, of course, she leaves out Black people. And from this, it seems that definitely the focus of the series and the diaries that were part of the series were entirely white women. So I also did a quick read through Ruth Shackelford's 2 diaries, the one from 1865 that I've been discussing thus far, that I'm still in the midst of mapping and recording. And then I also read through the 1868 diary. So here's what I found about Ruth Shackelford and mentions of Black people. There are no mentions of Black people at all in the 1865 diary. Perhaps she alluded to Black people in some way, but there were no mentions of Black people at all. The 1868 diary, when the Shackelfords traveled back from California towards Missouri, it ends before they actually reach Missouri, but they travel a southern route that takes them through Nevada and Arizona and into Texas. And in that diary, Ruth Shackelford mentions Black people in the 1868 diary, but only in a very specific context, and that is of Black soldiers that they see along the route after they leave California as they're traveling through the desert areas until they get into Texas. They go through a series of forts and watering holes that have Black soldiers stationed at them. And perhaps there's also a stage stand that some Black people might have been living at, but that's the only other context, and it's only the one mention. Otherwise, all of the mentions of Black people in this 1868 diary are entirely of Black soldiers, who she notes have white superior officers, but the only context in which she mentions Black people at all in either diary. So keeping that in mind, based on my reading of Sweet Freedom's Plains, it seems unlikely that there were no Black people that the Shackelfords would have run across during either of their trips except for Black soldiers. And perhaps it might be that Ruth Shackelford just chose not to mention any people like that because she didn't see them, or it wasn't a unique experience. Whereas in 1868, seeing Black soldiers might have been jarring to her or something unusual, and so she mentions it like every time it happens for about a month and a half. So from her first mention is in May 25th, 1868, and the last one is June 29th of 1868. So that's Ruth Shackelford. So she probably was one of those white diarist travelers that just does not mention Black people, even though they were part of the landscape. They were people who were also journeying or were at different places where the Shackelfords would have stopped or passed through. And this is a theme that happened that the author gets across in Sweet Freedom's Plains, that Black people not only traveled, but they were working in businesses or even running or owning businesses in the jumping off towns. So in Missouri and then also Nebraska, the places where travelers heading west would buy up provisions before they go across this area where supplies might be more scarce and definitely more expensive. And so the Shackelfords traveled through one of these jumping off places, the town of Plattsmouth, Nebraska, after they crossed the Missouri River. She did not like the east side of the river on the Iowa side, but loved Plattsmouth, Nebraska, said that it was a nice town with all kinds of business going on, but no mention of the people there. So I just want to let you know, so just keep in mind that Black people weren't only travelers, but they were involved in the provisioning of travelers, Black and white. Black people often didn't have the resources to provision themselves to travel entirely by themselves because of the high costs. And so they would usually travel as part of wagon trains organized by white people. Because the cost was so high, one option for them would be to join a wagon train in exchange for their labor. But sometimes Black people couldn't do that if the wagon train had a charter that specifically excluded Black members. So this was something that happened. We don't have information about the Shackelfords wagon train, nothing about it having a charter, although on June 4th, 1865, on their trip from Missouri to California, Ruth Shackelford records, quote, "This evening the men had an election to elect their captain. They elected Mr. Hardingbrook," end quote. And so there was organization, but not necessarily a charter. And so we have no idea if Black people actually were part of the same wagon train as the Shackelfords. It's not something that she mentions, and she doesn't give information about that. Another point that it creeps in here and there in Sweet Freedom's Plains, but isn't one of her major points, but it's something that I'm interested in, is the idea of Indigenous and Black relations. So slavery came to Oklahoma, which in the 1830s, because that was then Indian territory, because the Indigenous peoples were moved there on the Trail of Tears. And some of the Indigenous peoples included the Cherokee, Creeks, Muskogee, Chickasaws, Seminoles, and Choctaws. And these Indigenous peoples who lived in the South had also become slaveholders, and they brought their slaves with them. So there's a complication to our idea of relations between Indigenous peoples and Black peoples, that it wasn't the same throughout time. You have different power relationships. In this case, the Indigenous peoples who themselves were kicked off of their land, they held slaves. And what did Native peoples think, or Indigenous peoples think about Black people? In some cases, it looks like Indigenous peoples saw Black peoples as another kind of white person, someone who didn't belong, who wasn't from there, and they made no distinctions in the interactions with them. There were a few cases where Black people were seen to be an other and were held in high regard because of the color of their skin, but that seems not to have occurred very often. So often they were just seen as another type of invader. And Black people as well didn't necessarily take into account in what was happening to the Indigenous peoples. They were also proponents of Western expansion of the United States, so taking land from Indigenous peoples and not regarding the claim of Indigenous peoples to that land. So one of those people that really was in favor of this was Jefferson, the map maker. So he and others, they saw the West as a place of opportunity, and they were like, yes, we should expand here, and gave no regard to what was going to happen to Indigenous peoples because of that expansion. So why did Black people travel west? There's a very similar reason as white people did. Of course, they looked for opportunities. White people were looking for financial opportunities or freedom of some way, like the Mormons traveling to set up in the Salt Lake Valley. Black people were also looking for opportunities, although we have to note that some Black people went west as slaves, so they had no choice. Sometimes this would rip their families apart, but they had no choice because they were slaves to the white people heading west. And they were often, during the gold rush days, they were taken by their white owner and made to labor under harsh conditions without gaining their freedom. That was the case for slaves. Black people who were free also were looking for freedom from slavery and from freedom from being taken as a slave, even if you were free. Also looking for freedom from repression and more opportunities. But in Sweet Freedom's Plains, there's a description of how these Western states were not new blank slates for Black people in many cases, that there were still laws and policies in place to disadvantage Black people. One of these especially egregious ones was Oregon, that had a series of laws that excluded Black people from living there, voting there, or claiming free government land, which of course is land that the government had stolen from indigenous peoples, but that's beside the point. So this is the case also in Utah, where even though Black people could be Mormons, whether as a slave or free, they were still excluded from the highest parts of the Mormon church. So it was often the case that Black people didn't settle in the first location they stopped if conditions were not conducive to giving them opportunities and freedom. So they might move on and keep trying different places, especially if they were taken advantage of, which happens over and over again in some of the stories in Sweet Freedom's Plains. So that's the case for Black people. Ruth Shackelford, in her diary, she doesn't ever explain why they went to California, and especially why they only remained there like less than 3 years. They get to California in November of 1865, but they return to Missouri in 1868. There's no explanation of why they either come or go, although in one of the last entries in the 1865 diary, Ruth Shackelford says on November 3rd, after they come to San Bernardino, California, quote, "We are very much dissatisfied with the looks of the people and the country," unquote. And so it seems like the Shackelfords were not highly attached to the idea of being in California, and they certainly did not stay there long. So those are the major points I wanted to compare Ruth Shackelford's diaries and her writings with what we can understand about Black people on the Western trails from Sweet Freedom's Plains by Shirley Ann Wilson Moore. But of course, the book has many other points to be made, and I highly encourage you to read the book to check it out, especially if you want to know more about Black people's experiences. It's really illuminating. I just barely scratched the surface. So now I'm going to give you a little update on my progress on the mapping, which, if you remember in the last episode, I just talked about my problems exporting location data out of nodegoat so that I could use it in QGIS. And it turns out that it was a problem entirely on my part. I did not look, I got caught up in looking at the settings for setting exports that I neglected to actually push the button to export in the right way. So basically in nodegoat, what you need to do is go to the proper table that you're trying to export. So in my case, I was trying to export locations and select all the ones you want to select. They even have a handy button to select all of them. And then you just hit this lovely button for download, and they download as a CSV file, which then of course you can open up in QGIS and use the locations there. So I will be doing that in the future, which means that I can continue mapping as I have been. I had paused because it doesn't make sense to continue using software in which I would not be able to extract those locations, but crisis averted. It was just me not checking things out completely. All my fault. So that means I'm going to continue working on the mapping. I just set aside time to try to finish up the named locations in the 1865 diary. And I think I would like to go through and get the named locations in the 1868 diary done as well, and then go back and try to figure out camping places and things like that. Places with less certainty about their location. And of course, I'm looking for different reference materials that would be able to help. And there were a few that were actually references in Sweet Freedom's Plains that I'm going to look at and try to get a hold of, which of course is difficult because places are still under quarantine. I can check books out from my local library, but they don't always have all the materials. The library in a nearby town has the full Covered Wagon Women series, and I'll probably look at checking out some of those books from them when I move into doing more of the mapping and analysis. But otherwise, I would probably be able to look at the books in university and college libraries, but that's not a possibility right now with COVID-19 quarantines in place. But hopefully, in the not so distant future, I'll be able to go do more research and look at more things and get a better picture of what the Shackelfords were going through in the context of their travels. So, in this episode, I've confirmed that it always pays to look at the software twice. Don't assume that it's the problem, because usually it's you, the user. In case I'm the user. I was the problem in downloading locations that I had a problem with in the last episode. I also hope you enjoyed just the peek and just a little peek at the information in Sweet Freedom's Plains by Shirley Ann Wilson Moore. I put links to both the National Park Service PDF and to where you can actually purchase the book, which support her. She did really great work. I learned a lot from reading it, have a much fuller understanding of Black peoples on the trails and in the West, and all of the things they came up against when they were trying to travel and just live and be and reach freedom. And I just want to mention it again that I find it interesting that Ruth Shackelford in her diaries, so going from Missouri to California in 1865 and then traveling back to Missouri in 1868, but going from California and to Texas, that she only really mentions Black soldiers in the 1868 diary. So soldiers that were part of regiments after the Civil War. And I do not doubt that Ruth Shackelford saw other Black people on her travels. And it just makes me wonder why she didn't mention any of them. And I just have this idea that maybe it's because this idea of Black people being soldiers was unique to her perspective and in her mind, that's why she recorded them. But I don't know. But maybe we'll find out in the future. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the Hellenaki Deep Dive, please subscribe or leave a review and tell a friend about it. To support the Hellenaki Deep Dive financially, you can become a supporter on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. And at the $5 per month level or higher, you'll get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content every month. The Hellenaki Deep Dive is written and produced by me, Jen Globius of the Hellenaki. The theme music is Deep Ocean Instrumental by Dan O of danosongs.com. Thanks for listening.